Good morning and welcome.
Yes.
My name is Wendy Balla, and I've been asked to be the moderator for this event because I'm also a member of the Anti-Racism, Interfaith, Intercultural Forum. And this morning we're going to eventually welcome Jennifer Janzen-Ball, who is our theme speaker, but unfortunately came down with COVID this week and so has to join us by Zoom, which in one sense we're very sorry she's ill. On the other hand, it's wonderful that we learned all this technology during COVID so we can actually have her with us in spite of her illness. The equity monitors today are Reverend Phil Wilson, who's up in the balcony doing a lot of the technical work for us, and also the Reverend Ned Wells, who I did see earlier, is back here. So if there are any questions or concerns around equity, you could speak to one of those two individuals. I want to thank some of the people who worked in the background to make this day come to life. First of all, the Reverend Dr. Aruna Alexander, who is the chair of the Anti-Racism, Interfaith, Intercultural Forum, and has done a lot of the legwork to get this event into place. A special thank you goes to Reverend Mary Jane Hobden, who is the minister here at Kingsview, and to the church secretary here, Elizabeth, who has done a lot of the local arrangements and has spent a lot of their time that should have been Oshawa's Kingsview time working for us, so thank you. I also want to thank Anne, the organist, for the prelude this morning, and later we're going to be doing some hymn sing as part of Jennifer's presentation, and Anne will be playing for that, and Reverend Darren Leopold will be helping us by leading the singing this morning, so thank you for doing that. I'd now invite Dr. Aruna Alexander forward to do some welcomes.
Thank you, Wendy. It's Aruna Alexander, and I welcome you on behalf of our Anti-Racism, Interfaith, Intercultural Forum for ECORC. The aspiration to achieve our vision moves beyond statistical measurement. It includes plans and strategies and workable actions to overcome racism and discrimination in all its forms in our church and in the communities in which we live. I'm pleased to announce today that we have an interfaith guest with us from the Durham Interfaith community, and I'm going to ask her to stand for a minute. Farah Eshroji.
No problem. Good morning, all. My name is Farah. I'm from the Durham Multi-Faith community. I'm also a Baha'i in the community, and we're having World Religion Day on January the 20th at the Whitby Public Library from 2 to 4. I have sent the invitation to Aruna, and hopefully she'll be able to share it with your community. But thank you for having me today. And I'd like to add, so powerful is the light of unity that it can illumine the whole world. Thank you.
And now I invite Peggy Fillier to come forward for a scripture reading.
The scripture reading today is Philippians 4:4-9. Celebrate that you're on their side, working with them and not against them. Help them to see that the Master is about to arrive. He could show up at any minute. Don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petition and praise shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the center of your life. Summing it all up, friends, I say to you, do best by filling your mind and meditating on things true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious. The best, not the worst, beautiful, not ugly. Things to praise, not to curse. Put into practice what you've learned from me, what you heard, saw, and realized. Do that, and God, who makes everything work together, will work you into his most excellent harmonies. Amen.
And we'll have the land acknowledgement by Reverend Rodney Smith-Merkley.
Good morning, everybody. This is my first time in this church, so I did a little research before doing the land acknowledgement, and this is what I found. Indigenous people inhabited the Oshawa area long before the invention of the automobile. Imagine that. Oshawa is from the Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe-Moan word, Oz-Hawa, or crossing place. The natural harbor on the site was an obvious location for a trading post, connecting Lake Ontario with the inland river network. So Oshawa, it's that crossing place across Lake Ontario, and I've heard lots of stories of the lake being crossed in canoes. I brought along a book, and if you don't know this book, I encourage you to get to know it, the Michi-Sagig Nishnabeg. Michi-Sagig means the people who lived at the river mouths all along that north shore of Lake Ontario. This is our territory, and it's by Gitaga Migaze, or Doug Williams. And some churches, rather than do a land acknowledgement each Sunday, do a moment of learning. And so I know you could talk to Bob Rood about that, and Bob Cajun. They were saying Trent University just named its 6th college after Gitaga Migaze. Spotted Eagle is the late Doug Williams' spirit name. And in Doug's book, he talks about the Michi-Sagig people there's maps from time immemorial, and then welcoming some newcomers, the Huron-Wendat, who were south of the lake, and the neutral people, and they were corn-growing people. And so there were treaties, there were agreements to allow them to be on Michi-Sagig territory. And then in the 1650s, when disease came after European contact, the Michi-Sagig traveled north for about 20 years, and when they came back, the Haudenosaunee were in this territory, and there was a battle that drove them back south of the lake. So this is all part of the history of Oshawa, that crossing place. And I looked up just on the city of Oshawa and was talking to some folks at this congregation who are actually, it's kind of timely, they're just looking again at their land acknowledgement and what that might look like. But the city of Oshawa is situated on land steeped in rich Indigenous history and culture that is the present-day home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that we live and work on land covered within the traditional and treaty territory. So yesterday was the 100th anniversary of the final signatory of the Williams Treaty in 1923. There's another bit of learning for you to take away. So the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa, or Ojibwa, Anishinaabeg, that is covered by the Williams Treaties. We acknowledge the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee nations, among many other Indigenous nations, have utilized this territory for trade and commerce from time immemorial. So thanks for listening, and all of this is moot unless we work towards learning that history and truth, allowing healing to happen, and asking what reconciliation might look like and respectful relationship going forward.
Thank you, Rodney. It is good to learn more about where we are and how it pertains, so thank you. It's my privilege this morning to introduce briefly Reverend Dr. Jennifer Janzen-Ball. Jennifer is an ordained minister.
Recording in progress.
She's presently the head of the Theological leadership at the General Council office. She gained her PhD in Christian social ethics through Emmanuel College and the University of St. Michael's College at the Toronto School of Theology. She's originally from the prairies and presently lives in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Upon ordination, Jennifer was settled in the Blackville Pastoral Charge, which is close to my heart because it's part of Miramichi Presbytery, where I spent many years, and for many of those years was the secretary of that presbytery. And then following her time in Blackville, she returned to do her doctoral studies, and on completion, she spent 10 years as the director of the Designated Lay Ministry Program. And following that, Jennifer served as the program coordinator, ministry vocation at the General Council office before taking on her present position. She is passionate about eco-theological ethics and the climate crisis. And in her spare time, she likes to garden, knit, bird watch, and play pickleball. So welcome, Jennifer, and thank you. And I hope that you're feeling reasonably well in spite of your COVID diagnosis, but thank you for joining us and taking this time to present. And if following Jennifer's presentation, we have a 4-person panel who will respond to the presentation, and then there'll be a coffee break and then time for a small group discussion. Afterward, people will come back and report. But if you have any questions, you need to come to the microphone to ask them so that people are able to hear, both on Zoom and in this building. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining me today. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person with you, but I'm grateful that we have technology and people who worked very hard to make the technology work, both in setting it up yesterday and this morning. I really am missing the opportunity, though, to connect with you in person, and so hopefully at another point in time I'll be able to do that. I wanted to begin just by sharing a little bit of the work that I'm involved in as national staff person supporting the work of our National Theology and Interchurch Interfaith Committee, just to give a kind of highlight of that and then move into our theme for this morning. So our TICIF committee is the short form, it's a lot easier to say, has been working this past year since General Council met in 2022 on creating some principles to guide all of our national justice work. And those were actually just passed at the recall meeting of General Council in October. We're also working with the Anti-Racism Common Table on some education resources to help us continue to counter anti-Semitism within the church. And we will be starting in the new year, engaging the church in a study of discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ today and going into the future? And so those have been the three of the pieces of work that TICIF has been about. But the other piece that I'm going to spend more time on with you this morning has been looking at our theologies and histories of mission, our practices of it, and the impacts within the United Church. And when I was speaking with Aruna and Wendy earlier this year in planning this event, we thought that the focus on mission would be good for our time together because it also has ecumenical and interfaith implications, and it connects to our work on right relations, reconciliation, and reparations, particularly around our history of involvement in colonization and in residential institutions. So the bulk of what I'll share this morning will be focused on mission and helping us to both complicate it and understand it a little bit more, but also to then hear from my 4 co-presenters some of their responses to what I'm sharing this morning out of their own particular perspectives. And so I'm very grateful for that. To really start us off, though, what I wanted to do was engage us in some singing, because often in the United Church, we reflect that we sing our theology. Sometimes we get accused of having no theology, and that's simply not true. But we do sing our theology, and often some of our kind of unconscious theology that sits with us, I think, comes from some of our hymns. And so I've picked a few hymns for us to sing one verse of each this morning to just start us thinking a little bit about the kind of theology or understanding of mission that might be expressed in these hymns. So there's a variety for this morning. So I'll just invite you to hold that question. What is the understanding of mission that might be expressed in each of these hymns as we sing them? So our first one is going to be from Voices United, number 512, Lord, You Give the Great Commission, and we'll just sing verse 1. Great. So our next hymn is, again, in Voices United, number 601, The Church of Christ in Every Age, and I'll ask us to sing verse 5. Right, and then we are turning to number 326, Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing, and again, verse 5. All right, halfway through, I imagine people are okay continuing to sing for a little bit. So the next one, often we sing this during communion, but not always. So number 468, Let Us Talents and Tongues Employ, verse number 3. And for the last two, we're going to turn to More Voices. So More Voices, number 212, Sent Out in Jesus' Name. And our last one from More Voices again, number 154, verse 2, Deep in Our Hearts.
If people do have questions for Jennifer later, Phil is going to try and transcribe them into the chat for her. Because she isn't able to hear what we're saying down here. So just so you know, you can still ask questions later.
Okay, let's try this and see if this is going to make a difference. I'll just share a little of what I was thinking about those hymns. So there's a number of different images and understandings of what our purpose, our calling as disciples is to be, and what it means to take part in mission. Different images in each of those hymns, and some of those reflect theological understandings of the time, both in the past and currently. So there's some phrases around sharing the good news, about making disciples, about serving others and serving in the world, about sharing in a common purpose, and about bringing about God's realm of justice and peace, where none are hungry anymore. These are just some of the ways in which we have thought about it and understood mission both in the past and today. I want to spend a bit more time now talking about some of the problematic history and problematic certain theologies of mission, both kind of globally within the church as well as more specifically within the United Church of Canada. I'm imagining that many of you are very aware that Christianity, commerce, and civilization has been a bit of an unholy trinity in our history. You may be familiar with the phrase, the cross and the crown, which evokes this image of Christianity and colonization being inextricably intertwined. Mission, in the sense of converting people to Christianity, including forcibly, is part of this history. The use of the word mission to refer to Christian evangelism and conversion didn't really appear within Christianity until about the 1500s. And then the Great Commission, as it's known in Matthew's Gospel, was not understood to be a kind of text prompting missionizing and evangelizing or conversion until the late 1700s. Now, it might seem odd to suggest that a text that seems so obviously motivating for mission today was just rediscovered prior to 1819. That most theologians and congregational leaders of the Reformation viewed this so-called Great Commission as directed only to the apostles and wasn't actually applicable to any kind of contemporary missionary obligation. But in 1792, a man named William Carey popularized the verse, and it became relevant or understood as a command to go and evangelize the world. So the use of that particular scripture text is more recent within the history of Christianity. Now, to bring this a little bit closer to our own United Church histories and experiences, I want to share some words from Reverend Dr. Teresa Burnett Cole, an ordained minister in the United Church, who's Mohawk and has done some research on the history of mission within the United Church. And she noted that in Southern Ontario, most of the missionaries were American or British Methodists, with a few Moravians thrown in for good measure. Indigenous churches were established in several Indigenous communities, and often much of the missionary work was actually done by Indigenous evangelists, but they were working under the supervision of a settler Methodist minister. And much of the missionary work happened in Southern Ontario between 1820 and 1850. So when United Church Union happened in 1925, many of these churches were close to 100 years old with a deep history in their communities. But the founding denominations didn't consider these communities of faith to be full churches, although they had the same structure as settler churches. They were considered to be missions because of their being Indigenous. So these Methodist churches were not consulted like the settler churches were when church union took place. They were basically moved as an entirety, as a group, into the new United Church. And some of these churches weren't informed that upon union, their trusteeships had been dissolved and they were now under the so-called guardianship of home missions, which meant that their buildings were now part of the national stock of property and would be managed from a distance rather than by the local people in their local church. So Indigenous communities of faith have been fighting to regain their autonomy ever since. We see that the impact, if not the explicit intent of colonization and of mission understood as conversion, results in this system of unequal power between those who do mission and those who have mission done to them. Part of that impact is that if you think of it like a hymn or like a song, we basically create this one-note song where everybody is supposed to look and act the same, sound the same, instead of this beautiful symphony or perhaps a jazz piece. So the impact of this kind of practice of mission, particularly when it's been tied to colonization, has been to try to wipe out diversity and difference and replace it with sameness. So rather than like in a lovely jazz piece having melody, harmony, weaving together, building off of one another, even incorporating kind of discordant and jarring notes and playing off of one another's gifts and strengths and mistakes, colonization attempted to make everyone the same in religious beliefs and in culture. Andrew Kirk, who's a scholar who writes about mission, noted that the church has gone astray precisely when it has either ignored or reinvented the mission of Christ. How, for example, did the Spanish conquerors of Central and South America in the 16th century possibly have thought they were doing mission in the way of Jesus Christ? He goes on to say, though the problems of discovering and reapplying mission in the way of Christ may be complicated, the Christian community needs a standard by which to measure its own performance, a standard which is able to call in question its own policies, programs, and practices. Without this, mission simply becomes an arbitrary response to whatever particular culture or moment of history throws up. So we might ask, how has the United Church been engaged in this kind of reflection on its own practices and theologies of mission? Well, in good United Church fashion in the 1960s, we created a committee to examine the Church's theologies, histories, and practices of mission. So this isn't a new conversation for us. In 1966, the General Council received the Report on World Mission, which was an extensive review of mission in the United Church, historically and in the current context of the time. The authors of this report noted many of the same things that I've already pointed to. Newly planted churches weren't integrated into the mission. They were usually regarded as the fruits of missionary work, rather than as, quote, cells of continuing witness. Native evangelists were agents of the mission in its employ and on its payroll, responsible to the mission rather than to the indigenous or the church in the local context. This same report also notes that missionaries carried Western values with them and made assumptions based on their own Western backgrounds. They state that the missionaries tended to assume the prerogatives of leadership in all phases of their work. Wherever they went, they had the aura of the West upon them. They knew what was good for their churches, and they spoke with the same tone of authority, whether the subject was religion or sanitation or etiquette. So just in those two short quotations, you can see that this report on world mission was offering critique of the United Church's own theological understandings and practices of mission. Now, the report wasn't a scathing critique. It really is a reflective piece, taking time to address the intents and hopes of those individuals and organizations who were part of the missionary endeavor. And the report also notes the significant challenges with these efforts and offered a new way forward through what I see as three key elements: an understanding of partnership that we still carry today, ensuring agency for those churches who had been the recipients of mission, and a more holistic understanding of the ways in which Christianity can be lived out differently in different cultures and with different theological understandings. This report on world mission, looking back on it, seems remarkable in many ways for its time. But this was also written within the context of Vatican II and the opening up of the Roman Catholic Church to ecumenical and interfaith conversations. And it also happened in the global context of many colonized countries gaining independence. So I say this not to discount the significant work that this report brought and the setting of a new direction for the United Church and its understanding of mission, of partnership, of ecumenical and interfaith relationships. But it was also part of this broader kind of fervor and ecumenical and interfaith conversations that were happening at the time. I do also want to make it clear that those who were recipients of mission or who had mission done to them, as an Indigenous United Church elder recently said, also have agency. Now, of course, there are systemic realities that limited agency, as is the case for all of us. But I also want to name and acknowledge and uphold the reality that local people who received missionaries and became Christian began to also interpret and understand the gospel for themselves and began to shape worship, community life, and discipleship through their own lenses, needs, experiences, and cultures, just as Western Europeans had done for themselves. Another author notes this when they say, often after Western missionaries had gone home, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, Christians in the global South appropriated the Christian faith that missionaries had brought them and translated it into the local cultures and vernaculars. So the phenomenon of growth of Christianity in the non-Western world actually owes a lot more to Indigenous initiatives in local contexts than to Western missionary agencies. World Christianity therefore began to grow not only in numbers, but also in cultural variety and richness. This variation and growth occurred at the same time that Christian observance in Western Christianity started to wane. I am going to move now into sharing a little bit about the work of the mission working group that I named at the beginning of my presentation. First, it's clear that significant problems and harms have been caused in the name of mission carried out by the church, both here in Canada and globally. Mission has been wrapped up in a kind of colonizing system and expression of Christianity that has been perpetuated for several hundred years now, even if the use of the word mission to describe this is relatively new in terms of the life of the global church. And this continues to be a very live issue today as we continue to live in the reality of the context of residential institutions that the United Church and other churches in Canada ran, in the realities of the uncovering of unmarked graves. And so nationally, a mission working group was created to look again at our histories, theologies, and practices of mission. And this group is made up of some members from the Theology, Interchurch, Interfaith Committee, some from our National Anti-Racism Common Table, and some from the National Indigenous Church. We've been meeting since March and have been continuing to wrestle with the church's role in residential institutions, with the church's paternalism and colonizing role through missionary presence in other countries in the world, and wrestling with the complexity of knowing that some missionaries really sought to live with, understand, and take direction from the people whose lands they came to. I also want to name that often being a missionary was the only option for ministry for women who wanted to be engaged in the life and work of the church. And this was one of the very few options for them at the time. So our histories, our theologies, and our practices of mission are complex. In our own kind of language and histories, we've used mission in many different ways. We've talked about the mission to the Indians, the Board of Home Mission, our current mission and service fund. Many of you may remember the mission statements that many churches wrote in the 1980s and 1990s to express their understanding of their particular ministry and purpose. And we currently have a church and mission unit at the General Council office. We're also, of course, we continue to be an ecumenical church. And so part of what we are also aware of is that many of our ecumenical partners, both in Canada and globally, will continue to use the word mission, even if we have decided not to, which we haven't, but just to name that these are the kind of ongoing conversations that the Mission Working Group has been about. As the working group continue to delve into our own understandings and experiences of mission, we also came to realize that the use of the word mission is basically the tip of the iceberg, because what lies underneath it in terms of, as I've said, our theologies, histories, and practices is what the church really needs to wrestle with, not just the use of the word itself. So recognizing that our language does matter and that the word mission itself has very harmful connotations in history for some, the questions that the working group has before it are, can we, with faithful integrity and awareness of the harms done, continue to use the word mission itself? Is it possible to redeem mission? And if so, under what circumstances? And is there another word or other words that could be used instead that would carry a similar kind of meaning in terms of thinking about God's mission in the world that we're invited to be part of? The 1966 Report on World Mission states, more important than the motive with which one starts is the motive with which one acts after one has been involved in mission long enough to have learned better. So as a result of the mission working group's work, the Executive of General Council that met just last weekend passed a proposal requesting the development of resources to engage the church further in learning about the histories of mission work in Canada and globally, and particularly learning about the different ways in which this work was lived out in Canada and globally, because there's a distinct difference, particularly after the 1930s for global mission work, where missionaries really started to take direction from local people, but that was not the case in terms of missions with Indigenous people in Canada. And so wanting to highlight some of the different ways that mission was occurring in the life of the church. And we're called on to learn more about theologies that were foundational to particular understandings of mission. So the National Office will be working on developing some educational and worship material to help the church continue learning and to have these kinds of conversations. So this event is in many ways a kind of precursor of others that may happen. So you're ahead of the curve here. At this point, I just want to pause and check in to see that everything is going all right on the tech end. So one of the other pieces that I was asked to talk a little bit about is around our theologies in the United Church, and just to talk a little bit about the kind of breadth of theologies that we do have within the United Church. And I think this is particularly reflected in our understandings of mission, and I'll point us back to the hymns that we sang at the beginning. There are a number of different theologies expressed within those hymns, and that's the case across the United Church, not only across time in terms of our history, but in terms of our current context. And I think it's fundamental to United Church identity. And for me, some of that's reflected in the commitment we've had since Union in 1925, that ministers in the United Church need to be in essential agreement with our doctrine, thanks in large part to our Congregationalist ancestors. That means we don't have to agree with absolutely everything. And so there's room and freedom for various theological approaches and interpretations. And we see that in the various statements of faith that the church has periodically created over the years, through our various reports and educational resources, and through other decisions that have been made by the national church. And I think in the United Church, we have particularly tried to understand that theology is both a reflection of our own identities and experiences, and also held within this kind of wider container of theologies within Christianity, of which there's an even wider range, as you're well aware. There has certainly been a shift in terms of theological thinking and understanding to highlight and uphold the ways in which our identities and our experiences influence our own theologies and how we understand and live out our faith-seeking understanding. So, for instance, my own identity as a white, formally educated, middle-class, multi-generation Canadian who identifies as a cisgender female and queer, and who grew up on the Canadian prairies, all of those facets of my identity become lenses through which I understand my experience of God in dialogue with others. And I think that that's really important, because theology is never only about our own reflection on our experiences and understandings of God, but it happens in dialogue with those in communities of faith around us, with our national church, with ecumenical and with interfaith partners, nationally and globally. And all of that is necessary in terms of the theological enterprise. And I see that happening in the conversations that the Mission Working Group has been having, because people come with very different experiences and understandings of mission and the histories and theologies that have undergirded our practices of mission. And so that has been a really rich kind of wrestling. And I think that that's really important as we continue to think about our theologies within the United Church, that we continue to be in conversation, particularly with those who hold different theologies from us, and continue to try and understand one another. This also becomes part of the work that we're about, of becoming and living into becoming an intercultural, anti-racist, barrier-free, and affirming church. We need to continue to understand how our identities shape our theology, and how our theological convictions also shape our identities and discipleship in the world, and that this is a really important part of that desire and action to become intercultural and anti-racist. Our understandings and theologies, of course, also have implications for how we understand who Jesus Christ is for us, particularly, again, in a church that values ecumenical and interfaith work. And I think this also then ties into our understandings of, in classic theological language, what's called soteriology, or what does it mean to be saved or redeemed or liberated. And this is particularly, again, relevant for understanding both history and practices of mission, but our current realities as well, because how we respond to those questions of who Jesus Christ is for us and what's the significance of Jesus' saving work ties into then how do we live in the world, and how do we understand what it is to share the good news of Jesus Christ with others? What do we understand the purpose of sharing such news to be? And how do we go about that kind of sharing in ways that are both authentic to who we are as disciples of Christ, both individually and kind of communally or corporately in the United Church, but also with deep respect for where others may be in their own faith journeys, for those who are people of goodwill and who are interested in learning a bit more about Christianity, those that we're in ecumenical and interfaith conversations with in the somewhat more distant past in terms of our own United Church history. Part of our understanding was that people needed to become disciples of Christ in order to be saved, but that has led us to particular harms and realities expressed as we see that in residential institutions in particular, but not only. And so as we continue to wrestle with these kinds of theological questions, we also need to ask ourselves, what are the implications of these kinds of theologies being lived out in the world? And as a theological ethicist, the real world consequences are of particular interest to me. And so these are questions that I would invite us to continue to wrestle with. In my last few minutes, I just want to also uplift some work that's happening in our theological schools that is along these lines as well. And there's a group of faculty from each one of our United Church schools across the country. We've been engaged in work together for a year and a half about how we can continue to decolonize our theologies and uphold the kind of multiplicity of theologies that are already present within the United Church of Canada, with the aim of continuing to help us become an anti-racist church. And this has been an incredibly diverse and committed group of faculty, of scholars and teachers within the United Church who are engaged in this work with students at each of our colleges, and who are also working with staff at the National Church, myself and a couple others, to work at ways that we can continue to then help the United Church as a whole understand different theological perspectives and how our theologies can ground our work in becoming anti-racist.